two other individuals on the stage and the sufferings of the individual, and the chorus representing the will, the sort of collective will of the Greek people, began to be lost after you go through Sophocles, and Sophocles has this Oedipus Rex drama, and then Euripides comes on stage, and the problem is Euripides brings in too much intellect. He steps onto the stage and he begins rationalizing things. He's the first to sort of introduce the common man. He sort of brings in these common individuals, and instead of having this exalted, elevated characters who are walking archetypes, they become these sort of common men. And so the gods are portrayed and the heroes are portrayed as though they were just, you know, whoever from the back alleys. And not only that, but then he has the chorus gradually begins to be pushed out, so that the monologue begins to be taken over, and the monologue develops as a result of this doing away with the chorus and having the lead characters talk through these things out loud. So Nietzsche says that was when Greek tragedy began to fall apart, when the intellect came in. And lost in this perfect balance between Apollo and Dionysus was lost in favor of Apollo. But then Nietzsche says this was happening in Greek culture as a whole during this period, because this is the period of Socrates. And as Euripides was writing his tragedies, Socrates was going around questioning everyone about everything, which is good. I mean, this is the birth of the intellectual soul after all, but the problem with that is Socrates is turning everything into a problem. Everything has to be verbalized and analyzed to death. And for Nietzsche, this begins to, there's a turning point in every culture where the intellect takes over, and once the intellect takes over and begins to sterilize spirituality and the gods out of existence, the culture begins to fall apart, because it begins to lose contact with its myths. The myths are analyzed and scrutinized, and the light of reason. Plato writes all these things down. Plato started out wanting to be a dramatist, but you see, drama was dying out as a viable art form, and there just wasn't any creative energy, any potential within it for Plato to do anything with it. So he ends up inventing the dialogue, where you have these, you know, characters. Socrates is the lead character always in the dialogues of Plato, analyzing everything to death, but you have this vestigial relic of the dramatic form in the dialogue itself. And so Nietzsche says the Platonic dialogue was the life raft that Greek tragedy sort of clung onto as it was going down. And so then he sort of paints this picture of Greek civilization falling apart and the coming on stage of the Socratic man, and then Spengler picks this idea up from him and says, what if this can be generalized into a universal rule? What if we look at all these great high civilizations, and we find a turning point in every one of them where the Socratic man comes on stage and begins to question everything, and the culture begins to fall apart? And Spengler's response was, yes, indeed. Every one of these cultures, all the great high civilizations, fall apart when they shift over to a period of rationalism. It happens in our case when Rousseau comes in. Rousseau is the Rousseau and Voltaire. You know, there we are back again with the French. Questioning everything, analyzing everything, sort of Voltaire making fun of religion, and Rousseau sort of bringing in this kind of rationality and a kind of romanticism, but just sort of questioning everything. So our culture then begins to fall apart, according to Nietzsche and Spengler, right about in the 18th century, analogous to what took place with the Greeks in the time of Socrates. And then Spengler generalizes this, and he looks at Hindu civilization, and he says, well, the Buddha represented that, this aspect, the Socratic man appearing on stage in Hindu civilization. Here we have an individual appearing on stage who will have nothing to do with the gods, and original Hinayana Buddhism just has nothing to do with the gods whatsoever. It's a strictly nihilistic religion. Buddha steps on stage, and the only thing that is important is nirvana. Everything else is done away with. So original Buddhism is entirely nihilistic. And at the same time that Buddha was propounding these ideas, there was a philosophical movement known as the Sankhya system. And the Sankhya system was one of the first Hindu systems that began to spin out theories about the origins of matter, the three gunas, the Purusha, which is the soul and its involvement in prakriti, matter, without any reference to deities whatsoever. So India indeed did begin to enter into a period of rationalism, and but Spangler's thesis almost doesn't work here because the Hindus sort of made a recovery, and the period he says they should be falling apart, they're really going through a restructuring, and they sort of get it back together again for a while. But so that's sort of Spangler's starting point, is that all civilizations go through a cycle of rise and fall. And then he says there are 9 civilizations that have done this. And he eschews any sort of model of the great chain of being. He doesn't want any kind of evolution of consciousness here, except within the particular culture in question, going through this life cycle, beginning with inspired religiosity, moving into a lyrical, poetic phase, then into a kind of prosaic philosophical phase, and then into a disintegration. That cultural life cycle is the only thing that has to do with the kind of evolution of consciousness that he will admit to in history. But what he does is he says, my thesis represents a Copernican vision of history, as opposed to a Ptolemaic one. Now, what's a Ptolemaic vision of history? Well, a Ptolemaic vision of history is what you always get when you sit down in a classroom, and they say, open your textbooks to the Greeks, and we'll start there, with this ridiculous ancient medieval modern scheme where everything ends up with the moderns, and we as moderns are the center of the universe, and everything has led up to this point, and we're just the greatest thing on earth. Well, Spangler says, no, if each one of these civilizations has gone through the morphology of its life cycle, then what we're going through now is a life cycle embedded within Northern European civilization that is analogous to all of these others. Each one of these 9 cultures can be regarded as its own center, within which each one of these civilizations develops its own mathematics, its own arts, its own sciences. There is no history of art. There is no history of science. There is no history of truth. There are simply truths that make sense only when you look at them in the context of the civilization out of which it emerged. So looking at these 9 civilizations then, we can sort of start with the Babylonian, although Spangler doesn't say much about them because the Sumerian information had not come in yet, and the Babylonians are to the Sumerians what the Romans are to the Greeks and what we are to the Europeans. So we have the Babylonian civilization, which dates from 3500 BC. And he says each one of these civilizations lasts for about 1,000 years. So it takes about 1,000 years for a civilization to go through this life cycle. And if you look at the cultures which are around today in terms of the high civilizations, if you look and you say the Muslim world is still around, it's much older than that, the Hindus are here, the Chinese are here, well, in a certain sense they've passed their moment of creative lyricism. These are sort of gigantic petrified logs in a gigantic forest. What they're picking up from is the vitality of the West beginning to enter into its dying phase. And that's sort of revitalizing them. This idea, by the way, of the scales and the monster was taken over by the Christians as the Archangel Michael, who always carries a pair of scales. And on the scales you find the damned are always tilting down this way, and the saved are always up here, and the devil's trying to tilt the scales down toward this gigantic mouth with these razor-sharp teeth, which personifies hell, waiting to swallow up the damned. But the Christians took this straight out of the Egyptian mythology. So that's the central organizing idea of Egyptian civilization, this gliding surface. Everything is built out of these gliding surfaces over which the individual can find no purchase and must slide into the jaws of this beast, or the day of judgment. So then he says, what's the central organizing idea of, let's see, we have the Babylonian and the Egyptian, and then we have, the Greco-Roman, well, let's first finish with the Hindus and the Chinese briefly. He doesn't say much about these peripheral civilizations that I'm talking about, just sort of comments that he drops. The Hindu is this idea of the world as dream. If you look on the statues of all of Indian art, the eyes are always closed of whoever's represented, whatever god, whatever yogi, the eyes are closed. For the Hindus, the world is a dream, and they're gone down inward to find the source of that dream. And the entire world is Maya. It's an illusion in that sense, the outer world is. And they've sort of gone down inward to find that. And Spengler doesn't say much about the Hindu culture other than that morphology that we talked about. And for the Chinese, it is this idea of the Tao, which, in contrast to the Egyptian, which is just straight, it wanders. The Tao is this thing that's just the wandering path of nature, and the individual will be carried along this path if he or she is in touch with the Tao. There's a story about a Chinese emperor who tried to stop a flood by building dams, and that only made the flood worse. So the next emperor had success because he was in touch with the Tao by building canals to channel the water. So he was in touch with the Tao. So the Chinese idea is not resisting nature, but going with it, finding the Tao, which way it's going to fall, and go the way that nature is going to go, and you'll just be carried right along by it. So that's the sort of primary idea of the Chinese culture and the Indian culture. Now he recognizes the Mexican-American civilization, but he doesn't give a symbol for it because there again, not much was known at that time about that civilization. He just recognizes it and gives a little footnote about it going through this morphology. So that gives us those, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the Russian civilization, he says, is the only civilization that is yet unborn out of this group. The Russian civilization, the primary organizing symbol, you can already see it emerging, is this horizontal plane. A vast, horizontal, endless plane. If you look at the way the Kremlin is organized, it's this gigantic rectangular thing. If you look at the streets in Moscow, there are these huge, open, flat spaces. If you look at the Russian Orthodox churches, the spires are these so-called onion-shaped spires, in contrast to our Gothic spires, which just go straight up. Now, the Russian word for heaven is nebo, which in its end indicates something negative. The Russian, Spengler says, the idea of a Russian being an astronomer is ridiculous. And this may be the reason why the Russians never made it to the moon. For them, the heavens is something that really doesn't exist. They just see this horizontal plane stretching to infinity. They're looking down at the earth. That is really what they want. And when you look at the narrative, say, of Dostoevsky, there's this idea that Dostoevsky, in Crime and Punishment, for example, Raskolnikov has committed this crime against the Russian Brotherhood and must be brought down onto the plane with this sort of fraternal piety of this Russian Brotherhood. So that was the sort of idea that the Russian sense sounded like something that would be politically good for communism. Because there is this sort of collectivist brotherhood emphasis in the Russian culture, because that's consistent with this sort of horizontal idea, rather than the filial piety, which would represent the sort of vertical tendency to worship the Father. They just don't have that. So he doesn't say much about the Russian culture either, other than those comments, and that it represents the future at some point. Then the central discussion of the book is based on the contrast between the Greco-Roman civilization, which he calls Apollonian, and our civilization, the Northern European, which he calls Faustian. And he says the reason why we're so fascinated with the Greco-Roman civilization is because we are the two most opposite cultures. The biggest tension exists between these two cultures. There's one sandwich in between here that he calls the Magian culture, which is composed of the Judeo-Christian Islam